Hi, this is Kevin Stone for Keystone Outreach. This is topic 7, video 8 in the series. Today we're going to do a little bit easier one, maybe. This is in this video we're going to focus on what the Bible actually tells us about what we know as Satan, and more specifically, what it doesn't tell us about Satan. So I think we'll jump right into this. I'll pull out, we've got a list of some random of the verses that apply to or are said to apply to Satan. And I think what we'll do is I think we're going to start with a couple that are claimed to refer to him that don't, and that have given us some very specific, bad information. So I think we'll start with Isaiah 14. And do I have that one up? God, I hope I do. I don't, but I'll have it up in a second. But that's kind of one of the principal ones that gets falsely used. So in the 14th chapter of Isaiah, there's it's a long rant sort of against various of the wicked, and we have a proper name that gets introduced here that is very misleading. So we'll start at what we now call verse 12. It says, "How thou art," this is the King James Version, "How thou art fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet you shall be brought down to Sheol," significant. Gets translated as hell, but it unequivocally is Sheol, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee and consider thee, saying, Is this the man, that made the earth to tremble, that did shake the kingdoms, that made the world as a wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof, that opened not the house of his prisoners? And it goes on from there, but because of there's a portion where it says, how you're fallen from heaven, O Lucifer. This kind of language gets used a few times in the Bible in referring to humans who have attempted to exalt themselves to godhood. And Lucifer, the connection of the word Lucifer with the biblical Satan arises from this specific verse. He's referred to as star of the morning. It says son of the morning here. Lucifer is actually a term that was used to refer to what we call the planet Venus, and they referred to as the morning star. Now, the planet Venus was never associated at all with anywhere else with the biblical Satan. What the morning star is associated with is the pagan goddess Ishtar, called Astarte, or Ashtaroth. Is her little symbols of worship are called Ashtaroth in the Old Testament. So we know about her from the Old Testament. But the morning star has nowhere has it ever had anything to do with with the biblical Satan. And there are a couple of keys here that tell us that this isn't talking about Satan. It's talking about ascending to heaven and exalting my throne above the stars of God. This is something that a human would do. We know that Satan, for example, from Job, whatever else is going on with him, he apparently has the ability to walk freely wherever he wants to go, whether or not this is his world. He certainly just walks up and has this conversation with God about Job a couple of times in that book. Also, we're told that the punishment that's being promised here is that he will be brought down to Sheol. Now, if you actually watch the video on heaven and hell, the abyss is the place where the demons, I guess, the minions of God who not just fall into error, because certainly Satan and his host appear to be free to do their mischief. They're only brought down or cast down into the abyss specifically when they get really, really out of hand. Now, this is saying that this person, this king, and it calls him a king, will be cast down to Sheol. Sheol is hell. That's where dead people go. To the sides of the pit, it says. So that's at what's designated as verse 15. That's telling us that this is a person who's exalted himself as a god, but isn't a god. He's not going to get thrown into the pit. He's being thrown into Sheol. And it goes on it talks about him being a king whose kingdom has made the earth tremble and exalted himself. So who would this be? Who would this be? Well, Babylon and the kings of Babylon were dedicated to Ishtar, and an early symbol for Babylon was the star of Ishtar, which is actually what we call the planet Venus. And the reason the planet's called Venus is because Venus is just the Roman version of Ishtar. So Isis, Astarte, even Freya in the later Germanic and Norse mythologies is these are all the same pagan goddess, Ishtar, and that her star was the symbol of Babylon. This is talking about the king of Babylon, and this is a threat against a mortal king. There are scholars who believe that the specific Babylonian king that is being referred to as Esarhaddon, certainly possible, but this is not Satan. And so Lucifer is not Satan. It's a misnomer. And it's significant to note, but biblical scholars will note, and you can read up on this, the association of Satan with this Lucifer didn't occur until after John's revelation, where some of the things that are described as happening with Satan, the great Satan, seem to sort of parallel this prophecy from Isaiah, and so they were synchronized. But this isn't talking about Satan. This is talking about this is a specific threat to the king of Babylon, and you have to remember at this time, the time of Isaiah, Babylon was a major empire. So this is not Satan. Lucifer is not Satan. Another of the verses that is frequently attributed to or said to refer to Satan that patently doesn't, and this is actually a fairly late association. This is an association that was not drawn until fairly recent scholarship, but that's Ezekiel chapter 28, and we'll read this. But the verse itself tells us exactly who it's talking about. This isn't talking about an angelic being. This isn't a prince, a tsar. This is a king, and it uses the Hebrew word melech, which is king, like an earthly king. And significantly, the supernatural beings, like Michael and the prince of Persia, they're called, the term tsar gets translated as princes. We think as princes as being inferior to kings, like the son of a king. But the old terms that were used and that get translated into king and prince in the Bible are the other way around. A king is just a man. Unless it's talking about the king or the eternal king, like Christ as the eternal priest king, or God as the ultimate king. But the title king gets used. That's if it's talking about a king in the Bible, it's talking about a man. If it's talking about a prince, it's getting translated as prince. That's translated from tsar. It's the same word that seraph or seraphim comes from. And there are some rare occasions where it's used to refer to a military captain, a military leader. But basically, if someone is called the Tsar of fill in the blank, and it gets translated as prince, it's talking about that. There, it's talking about what we would consider to be an archangel. So, what does Ezekiel say? It says, Son of man, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, you are the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. It goes on to name all these precious stones. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade you were filled with violence in your midst. You sinned, so I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. This is a mockery, is what it is. This isn't talking about a literal cherub. This is the king of Tyre, and it's in the midst of a rather long proclamation against the actual king of the actual city-state of Tyre. And what this is referring to is a lot of these self-styled god kings of these city-states considered themselves to be demigods or even higher. They exalted themselves as gods. Certainly the pharaohs did the same. They considered themselves to be demigods whose ultimate, great grandfather was Ra. So this is a king who has elevated himself, and certainly there are depictions of these kings in the attire of actual pagan gods, so where they associate themselves with one or another god. And that's what's happened here, is that this is a mortal king, a king of Tyre, and he's being mocked for holding himself to be the greatest of all things, great in beauty and exaltation. But this is a king. And again, in context, it is clearly not about a cherub, not someone who literally walked in the Garden of Eden. This is a king who has exalted himself, and if you go on and read down in context, the whole thing is about the fall of this king of Tyre. It's a proclamation against him and his blasphemy. So what does the Bible say about Satan? Well, the first thing that we read about Satan is in Genesis with the serpent deceiving Eden. Now, how do we know that the serpent is the serpent? Because later is Satan? Later in the New Testament, John tells us pointedly that is the high Satan. Most of what we actually have written about Satan per se, other than I guess Job is one of the early books that specifically talks about Satan with his sort of bet with God about that Job wouldn't continue to worship him if he treated him badly. But aside from that, the Old Testament is pretty sparse on actual statements about Satan, and we'll dig through here and see. Most of them are going to be from Job, and we all know that story. There's not really a good reason to talk about that. Certainly, Saul of Tarsus spills a lot of ink about Satan, but you know what we think about Saul of Tarsus. So we'll give those a miss. But certainly John refers to Satan or the devil, and we hear quite a bit from him. Here a couple of verses. One from the first one we'll do from 1 John, where he says, "Whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil." Pretty clear cut. Doesn't tell us anything about who he is, but we do know that he's been bad from the start. There's also from John chapter 8, you are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning. We're told he was a murderer and has nothing to do with the truth. This is Christ speaking, by the way, in the gospel, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character. He's a liar and the father of lies. So we know he's the father of lies. We're told he was a murderer. In the Revelation, certainly, John's Revelation, he talks about the great dragon being cast down, not the beast, the dragon who gives power to the beast. And he says, for example, in the 12th chapter, verse 9, and the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. So he gives us the epithets. Notice there's no Lucifer in here. He's who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So when there are other references to Satan as the king of this world, the Lord of this world, there you have it again in John's Revelation. He tells us that he and his angels, his minions were cast down to earth, and here they are. This is their place. Let's see. We'll flip through just a couple of others that are relevant. Also at Revelation, kind of a continuation, I guess, of Revelation 12. Let's see. I was just saying one through. Anyway, it says, "But woe to you!" This is after the description of him as the devil and Satan and cast down to earth. He says, "But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." So once again, Satan cast down to earth. He's talked about in chapter 20 as a deceiver. The devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and false prophet were. Notice that the beast and false prophet had already been cast down there before, at the end of this life. Devil, this goes back to our last video about heaven and hell, and or actually, let's see, which one was it? Yeah, heaven and hell, because we're talking about how the beast and the false prophet get cast into the lake of fire at the end of this world. Satan, not until he's had another chance at temptation, at tempting us in the next earth, in the New Jerusalem. So there's that. And then again in Gospel of John at chapter 12, it says, now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. Again, Satan as ruler of this world. And there's similar mentions in Matthew from Christ, where he said, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, for example. But John also refers to him, Christ refers to him as saying that in the Gospel of John, saying he doesn't have much more time to talk to us because the ruler of this world is coming, he says. So again, referring to Satan as the ruler of this world. He similarly, Satan tempted Christ as he was fasting and offered him the world, took him up on a high mountain and said, all this can be yours. If he's not the king of this world, then how could he offer the world to Christ? How meaningful of a temptation would it be if he didn't actually have it to offer? And certainly Christ was in a position to know. So, but anyway, let's take a look. Peter mentions also that he says of the devil that he prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour, and to resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brethren throughout the world. So there's that mention. But beyond that, precious little. In the New Testament, most of the references to Satan are by John, either in his gospel or his epistle or in his revelation. Peter has a couple of mentions, but that's about it. And then other than that, there's Job, there's Genesis, talking about the serpent, and not much else. So where do we get all this stuff? Where do we get it? Do you think it's more likely that men devoted to the study of Scripture got it all so horribly wrong and convoluted, just accidentally, and somehow we just accidentally created all these false notions of who and what Satan is, and with all this great sort of expansion of the description of him and his character and everything, or that Satan is interested. Satan himself has a vested interest in having his identity confused. And I think it's more likely the latter. There's no excuse for believing that the king of Tyre, when we know that there was a kingdom of Tyre, and we know that those Phoenician cities were the source of all sorts of just pagan evil. I mean, that's where Jezebel. That's how Jezebel ended up. She married Ahab and brought down Israel, brought down into paganism, changed the religion. Those Phoenician city-states were nothing but trouble, and so a pronouncement against the king of Tyre, where it goes on to in much greater detail, and obviously with great specificity about it being the king of Tyre. How does that get conflated into Satan? How do they all get run together? It's an intentional confusion. By the way, one of the interesting things, and we'll go back, of course, a lot of what I'm teaching here, really, if I accomplish anything, it would be to disabuse you of the idea that Saul of Tarsus was anything but a false prophet. uh, the irony of ironies. Who is it that tells us that Satan appears as an angel of light? Saul of Tarsus. But how does Saul of Tarsus describe his initial meeting with who or what he believes to be Christ, which clearly isn't Christ because the things that he teaches Saul are contrary to what Christ himself taught. How does he describe it? Vision of light, angel of light. You know, he saw this vision, this blinding light. It blinded him. And yet Saul, who himself says, Satan appears as an angel of light. I mean, it's almost like an extra little jab of of lies and temptation, from his father. That the person who saw the false Christ as a vision of light tells us plainly Satan appears. Even Satan can appear as an angel of light. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. But anyway, I mean that's about it. There's almost nothing in the Bible about Satan. He gets mentioned a few times. Most of what we know about him is from the Revelation, but people freely confuse the dragon or serpent, Satan, with the false prophet, which is separate, and the beast, which is separate. There are multiple entities there. And if you believe they're the same, then you tell me how it is that in the verse I read above, how can it be that it says that Satan will be cast into the lake of fire, into which the beast and the false prophet have already been cast? They're three separate entities. So, where do we get the whole Satan? I mean, the whole serpent and dragon thing. What we have in Scripture is a presumption of common knowledge that has been lost. What we fail to account for is that in these days, and particularly at the time of the Old Testament, I really need to silence that, don't I? That at the time of the Old Testament, the pagan religions were spread everywhere, and there were different variations of them, or different city-states worshiped different of the what we call the pagan deities. But they all knew who all the others were. They were all sort of the same thing. And if we go back to the earliest traditions, in the beginning of the first civilizations after the flood really were the primary ones were Akkad / Assyria. Akkad, same region, same ethnically the same people, known initially as Akkad, and later upon taking the deity Ashur as their chief deity, they became known as Assyria, land of Ashur. So there was Akkad / Assyria. There were there was Babylon and the other Mesopotamian city-states in what we call Sumer, what the Bible calls Shinar. So this was like Uruk, this was the Sumerian Uruk, Lagash, and Babylon, and a few others. These were sons of Canaan, and then there was of the principal nations, if you want, confederations or unified empires. There was then there was Egypt, and there were some lesser ones like Cush and some of these like that. And then there was what we call gets referred to as Urartu. We also know them as the Hittites. We also know them as the Aryans. So if we go back to these earliest city-states, they'll have the same story. The same story. They have these, what we would now refer to as gods. They call them the Den-Gir, 2 syllables, Den-Gir, who came and went from Earth, but they would be here for long periods of time and then come and go. And they were from some place called Nibiru, which the best indication is it's a heavenly body, a planet of some sort. In all these stories, Nibiru only comes near to Earth once every 3,600 years. So it appears to be talking about some sort of heavenly body that's on like a cometary type orbit that every 3,600 years passes through the solar system, and at that point in time, these Den-Gir could come and go. This probably also has something to do with the original concept of Saturnus, which was considered to be like a second sun. Nobody really knows what that means, but a lot of the solar cults don't refer to the reason that there are 2 sun gods, for example, in Egypt, Aten and Ra, is that there's the sun that's the star at the center of our solar system, and then there was this other sun that later was called Saturnus. But what do we know about these Den-Gir? Well, they were the lords or overlords of another people that were called the Anunnaki. The Bible talks about them. They call them the Anakims. They were relative to us. They were giants, and we're told also that the quote sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and took to wife as many as they chose, and to them were born giants and men of great renown. This is the demigods of ancient, we would say mythology. They would say history. So the Anakims or Anunnaki were larger than us. Their hybrid offspring with human were larger than us, were giants and men of great renown, like Perseus and Hercules. That's what they're supposed to have been, right? And Goliath of Gath later, for example. But they came and went. This explains also how before the flood, who were these other people? There were other people here that the generations of Noah were not supposed to commune with. They were not supposed to interact with at all, and they did. And because they did, the world was destroyed to wipe out their hybrid spawn. So, of these Den-Gir, there were 7 of these chief deities. There was only one female among them. That was what we know as Ishtar, Isis, Astarte. That's who Easter is named for. And then others, their names changed through the years, but their identities remained basically the same. Some of them were a lot harder to pronounce in the original pronunciations, like Ningishzida, for example, who is the same as Hermes and Mercury and that sort of thing. There was a moon god called Sin that the Sinai Peninsula is named for, the wilderness of Sin. Nanar was the original name, and he was also then known as Sin. There was Enlil. We discussed Enlil a little bit in the Prince of Persia discussion. And Enlil was which is actually En. That syllable means a high lord or high king, sort of like Sar does. So any of these who had the En prefix to their name were chief among the Den-Gir, and there were 2 of them actually. So one is Enlil, who was an early chief god of the Sumerians, but eventually was displaced by another kind of an upstart god that was added to the seven, called Marduk, which is the Baal of the Old Testament, Baal or Bel of the Old Testament, became the chief deity of Babylon later, and also is identical with Ra. So, as a matter of fact, if you see any, if you read much on ancient comparative theology, you'll often see Marduk hyphenated with Ra, Marduk Ra. They're the same deity. And then there was the other of the high lords. There were the two original ones, that was Enlil, and the other is Enki. And Ki, the syllable Ki, means the earth. That's the ancient word for the earth. Enki was Lord of the earth. Now, as you may know from the Egyptian depictions, most of these deities were associated with an animal of some sort. They were given like an alternate depiction. Hathor was a cow, for example. There are various various depictions for these different deities, but the original serpent or dragon, he was interchangeably depicted, and these appear to be like epithets. I don't think there was a concept that they were actually, half animal or could change into animals. It was sort of like their talisman or their alternate, their secret identity or whatever. But the serpent / dragon was Enlil, whose title is Lord of Earth, not Enlil, I'm sorry, Enki, Lord of Earth. He was considered to be the father of Marduk, and really, and then Marduk was also depicted as a dragon, perhaps as the son of the dragon, or perhaps Marduk wasn't a son at all, but just a continuation under a different name of Enki, Lord of this earth. But this is where, so there is an ancient deity called the Lord of this earth, whose standard depiction was as a serpent or a dragon. And certainly, all the way up, even to the time of Christ, people would have understood who's being referred to, what pagan deity or something masquerading as a god is being referred to. So that's our context. That's the context that we have. Just as a sort of anecdote, so you understand how this stuff ties together and how the commonality of this history, the cohesion of it through the millennia. When Alexander the Great rose, he believed himself. His mother was a priestess of a serpent cult. Serpent cult. What do you think that means? And so she led him to believe that his father was not Philip of Macedonia, the king, and he was not a legitimate son of Philip anyway. But rather than tell him that he was an illegitimate son of Philip, even though that's ostensibly what he was, a bastard son of the king of Macedonia, she told him that his real father was their god, which was the same as Marduk and Ra. That's who she said was his father. And as a matter of fact, his entire conquest was his attempt to fulfill what he thought was his divine right. The reason he went and conquered Babylon is he thought that in the temple of Babylon that he would find the way to get in touch with his real father. He actually believed he was the son of Marduk Ra. And that's also why his generals conquered Egypt. Same thing there. They wanted to get to the bottom of, the Book of the Dead ostensibly is a literal overland path. It's a map of how to get to a sacred ascender that's hidden somewhere out in the Sinai. And the ascenders, the Bible talks about the ascenders. Jacob saw one. They were, and they're talked about in a lot of the ancient civilizations. They were some device or means to transit between Earth and the Shemayim, the heavens. And we don't know what they were. There were depictions of them, and they're weird-looking things. They don't make any sense. It's nothing natural. We aren't aware of anything unnatural, any man-made thing that looks like them either. And that's one of the drawbacks of doing these like this. I don't have the means to provide you with graphics and images and stuff, but look it up. Ascender, ancient ascender. But he was looking for an ascender. He thought that between Babylon and Thebes, that he could that he would find the way to an ascender and to be able to go meet what he thought was his true father. But again, so his mother was from a serpent cult, and he believes he's the son of Marduk, Baal, Ra, so the commonality is all there. But this was the backdrop against which the Old Testament, that's why it didn't have to tell you a lot if it talked about this quasi-deity whose identity was the same as the serpent or dragon of old. Then everybody back then would have known who it was. Now, what were the Anunnaki? What were the Dingir? Do we know? I mean, the Bible does refer to them. The Bible does refer to them. It tells us about the Nephilim, which is almost certainly the actual Dingir, and it tells us about the Anakims, as it says. That's their translation for Anunnaki. And Anunnaki, by the way, directly translates. Anu was the old Sumerian word for heaven or the heavens. Ki is the was, as I said, was the old word for earth. That's what they called earth. Not in Hebrew, but in Sumerian and Akkadian. In Hebrew, earth is Eretz, E-R-E-T-S. But in the ancient languages, it was Ki. And so Anunnaki is those who, it basically just means heaven to earth, those who came from the heavens to earth. Now, did they come in a spiritual sense? They certainly seem to have been fairly, physical or corporeal. And interestingly enough, in the old, the earliest, quote, mythologies, and the earliest stuff is actually very cut and dry. It's not until later where we have the Marduk hero stories and things like the writings like what we call Enuma Elish, which means went up on high. That's kind of painted as the Babylonian creation story, but it's a much later mythology, and it very much is mythology. Just like the Greek stories are heavily mythologized. But if you go back to the earliest stuff, it's pretty cut and dry. And what's interesting is that, for example, they say that their knowledge of the planets and their orbits was given to them by the Anunnaki, and as it happens, they knew every planet, including Pluto, which we ostensibly didn't discover until after 1930. They not only did they know about Pluto and its existence, they knew the eccentricities of its orbit, that sometimes it orbited inside and other times, but most time outside the orbit of Neptune. They knew the angle of the inclination of its orbit against the orbital plane of the other planets. They knew this. How did they know that? Clearly, there was somebody, whatever you want to believe the Anunnaki were, there was somebody that had the knowledge to be able to tell them that. Now, even more interesting is at the beginning of Genesis, we're told about how the upper waters are divided from the lower waters. We're told there's this whole creation thing about the world being made formless and void, and then the upper waters being divided from the lower waters. There's actually a complete scientific story that's related by the Sumerians about the destruction of a planet. There used to be another planet called Tiamat, and even the name Tiamat is echoed in at the beginning of Genesis, where the terms formlessness and void are translated as Tehom and Bohu. Well, in the Sumerian story, this planet Tiamat had a satellite that was that later came to be known by the Babylonians, as they started heavily mythologizing the story, as Behemoth or Bahamut. There were these, and they got converted in the Enuma Elish into these twin monsters of chaos. So that's where we get the Tiamat and Behemoth or Bahamut today. The Bible, they just get deconstructed into simple nouns, Tehom and Bohu, which is formlessness and void. But in the Sumerian story, they describe a planet whose orbit became unstable. And remember, we're talking about that these Anunnaki, according to them, came and went with the passing of this other body that they called Nibiru. And in this story, it says that because the Anunnaki on Nibiru, they needed to know where they had this, they call it the Chart of Destinies, which, with it being a fairly simple language, you could easily understand how an orbit would be translated as destiny. And it describes how they needed to know where all of these, and they named the planets. They have names for every one of them, and they describe how it's important for them to understand where the destinies of each of these planets, the orbits, was going to be when they pass through. You can well imagine that if in fact it is some heavenly body that passes through every 3,600 years, it'd be pretty important to know that you're not going to collide with another planet or get slung out of orbit because of getting too close to its gravitational field or whatever. And so it describes that this big watery world called Tiamat had become unstable and was threatening the destinies, the orbits of these other planets, and to create chaos. Obviously, if you're only coming through at once every 3,600 years, it's pretty important to know where a really big planet's going to be and that you're not going to smack into it. So the story they tell is that they artificially destroyed and then stabilized the remains of this planet Tiamat, and that the satellite, which later became known as, was called Bahamut or Behemoth, in the original Sumerian it's called Kingu, and it's as the story unfolds, it's what became our moon. And so their story is that when this planet was smashed, it was divided into an upper half and a lower half, and one half became what translates as the hammered bracelet between their names for Mars and Jupiter. And then between Mars and Jupiter was left this debris field, basically, this hammered bracelet of the upper half, and that the lower half then recoalesced into a smaller planet called Ki. That's us, Earth. So Earth, they say, came from this larger planet that got destroyed with its half of it becoming the asteroid belt, the other half settling into a lower orbit with the satellite Kingu artificially stabilized against the smaller resultant planet. Now we know one thing, the moon is much too large to be a captive satellite. So it was long theorized that it was actually from the same material of Earth, and somehow they kind of split apart, and this big chunk, just got stuck orbiting. Well, we know now, having been to the moon, that it's not. It is a captive satellite, and yet it's not. That's not possible. It's got too much mass. It's much too large relative to the size of Earth to be a captive satellite. It's also strange in that it has zero rotation. That's why we have a dark side of the moon. So it's artificially stabilized. Now, The Anunnaki, interestingly enough, when they number the planets, how do we number the planets? We start with the sun. Mercury's 1, Venus is 2, Earth is 3, third rock from the sun, and on out. They number them the opposite direction, like somebody coming in from outside the solar system, with what we call Pluto as 1, etc., on through until the 9th planet is Mercury, and then the sun. And in the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian, they also divided the space, the orbital space. Everything outside the asteroid belt, they call the upper waters. And then everything inside they called the lower waters. And this again is echoed in Genesis, where it says that the firmament, and firmament, if you look at the root for the word firmament, it comes from the same root as the Sumerian that they use for hammered bracelet. They're etymologically related. So the a firmament doesn't mean the sky. Firmament means exactly the opposite. It's something of substance. Again, hammered bracelet is how it's described. And it says it divides the upper waters from the lower waters. Well, in Sumerian and Akkadian, the upper waters and lower waters were one side or the other of the asteroid belt. So whatever they are or were, they appear to be, physically coming in from somewhere else. Now, some people say, "Oh, so you think they're aliens?" Well, I don't know what you would mean when you say alien, and we don't know what that still wouldn't tell us anything about what their nature is. But we know that we're told that Satan is the Lord of this world, which means somehow he's more or less bound at this point to this world. So I guess you could concoct some way that an angelic being or a spirit, could be physically bound to a world or to a planet. But it seems like it would be a lot easier to have something confined that is somewhat physical or corporeal entity. But anyway, we the point is, and certainly in these ancient histories, none of this says that they got it right. This was their concept. Maybe this was how they understood these beings. They could only think of beings in terms of being physical like themselves, and maybe they weren't. But the reality is that before the Bible was ever written, because it didn't get compiled until the time of Moses, which was a long time after Abraham, which was a long time after the flood. So we had a couple of thousand years of history before the Bible was ever began to be codified, that it's referring back to. So as I say, nothing we know about Satan, nothing we know about Satan is true. He's not called Lucifer. Lucifer is referring to a king of Babylon, but as an epithet, referring to his symbol of the morning star of the planet Venus, which was a symbol for Babylon. That's why it's depicted as a 7-pointed star in antiquity, and that was part of the symbol of Babylon. It's also the original depictions of the star from the crescent star of Islam comes from there was a the Muslim faith arose from a lunar cult that worshipped the moon god Nanar or Sin, hence the crescent, and then that same religion also held in veneration the goddess Ishtar, and so Venus was always depicted as that 7-pointed star. So the early depictions in Islam of the crescent star, it's a 7-pointed star. It's the same one that was the star of Babylon. At this point, I'm probably losing you. But understand this. Lucifer was not Satan. The king of Tyre was not Satan. So anything that we're told about that person has nothing to do with Satan. So what do we know? We know that he had the epithet of, he was either the serpent or the dragon. We know that he was a liar and a murderer and continues to be so and always would be so. We know that he hates Israel because it's the dragon who pursues the woman, Israel personified, to her place prepared. We know that. And beyond that, we don't know much. He's a special accuser. He's the Lord of this world. We're told that. But that's all. And anything else you think you know about Satan, you don't know. And if you try to mix in, if you try to throw in some of the descriptions of the beast, you're barking up the wrong tree. Different guy. False prophet, yet another different guy. The harlot sitting astride the beast, another person entirely, because the beast makes war, ends up turning on her and making war against her, destroying her utterly. All right, so, boy, somebody's really trying to get a hold of me there. That's what we have. So, this one certainly is open to further discussion, questions, and whatever. If you manage to get through all what's going to end up being an hour of this, shoot me an email if you've got questions. And again, our email is keystoneoutreach@gmail.com. I'm starting to get that right first time now. So you can shoot me an email. You can follow up in the comments wherever you're seeing this. But think about it. There's so many things that you know about the Bible that you don't know at all, because it's all just nonsense that's been gradually glommed on to the faith. So that's it. That's who Satan is and isn't, and we'll see you at the next one. Again, Kevin Stone for Keystone Outreach. Thanks for watching.